story with you about Michael Yannick. He grew up just like any other kid in the US. He was well liked. He was good in sports. He was well loved. And he wanted to do well in sports and in school, and also get a good job and have children. And that's what he wanted to do. When he was playing football, he got frequent injuries. And football in the US is just like the rugby you're used to. They get a lot of injuries. So he went to his doctor, who gave him non-steroidals and Tylenol and paracetamol. That worked for a while, but not for too long. After a while, his doctor started giving him heroin. Not necessarily heroin, it's OxyContin. That's a prescription version of heroin. And that helped him perform more and lead better. The demands of the game is such that you had to do more, you had better, you had to do better, and you had to be more competitive. So he got more injuries, and he got more hydrocodone or opiates. And his parents noticed that. They went to his doctor and said, "Doctor, don't give him any more because he's addicted." But the doctor would not listen. He continued to prescribe for a variety of reasons. And one fine day, he was found dead, an accidental overdose. His story is one of thousands of similar stories, near identical stories across the United States. How did this happen? How did this happen without anybody realizing that? You could trace the origins of that to the 1960s. And some of you may be aware, know about the thalidomide disaster. When thalidomide was prescribed to pregnant women, there's a high likelihood that their children would have birth defects. But there was no database at the time. So folks in Boston created the Boston Collaborative Drug Surveillance Program, which pretty much started collecting data about the effects of drugs. And they had thousands of entries and a lot of data. And Dr. Herschel Jick was the person who was in charge. One day he told one of his trainees, "Go and look at patients who have been treated with opiates. See whether there's anything unusual." And the trainee did a good job and found about 12,000 patients who were prescribed opioids, and only 4 of them, just 4 of them, were addicted. And Dr. Jick wrote a letter to the editor. He dictated, of almost 12,000 patients treated with opiates while in a hospital before 1979, and whose records were in the Boston database, only 4 had grown addicted. Just less than 1%. And he did not think much about it. And in fact, he had forgotten about what he wrote until he was asked about this letter to the editor recently. A New England Journal of Medicine published it. It says addiction is rare in patients treated with narcotics. And I think most people forgot about it, except this man and his family. Arthur Sackler is one of the richest people in the US and in the world. He was the first inductee to the Medical Advertising Hall of Fame. I did not know such a thing existed. He managed to market Valium beyond $100 million. And the marketing community liked it. They loved it. So he was the first inductee to this Hall of Fame. And that company saw the potential in the OxyContin market. OxyContin is virtually heroin. They started a very aggressive marketing campaign. Started the pain scale, which we are all familiar with now. I don't know of any nurse or a doctor who does not talk about the pain scale. Pain became the 5th vital sign. If you don't take pain as a vital sign, you could get written up. I know doctors who get written up and go to peer review because they did not treat the pain enough, meaning that they did not get narcotics. The company resorted to different strategies. And they had the audacity to give away cuddly bears and cuddly toys. So the patients would go home and give to their children, and hey, look, it's future business. And they knew exactly what they were doing. Now, number of studies have shown that when there are enticements, the prescription increases. And most of the prescription is reasonable, but some of that may not necessarily be. The company invested from little over $500,000 to more than $30 million in the span of 5 years. That's a lot of spending. They recruited prominent physicians, number of them, hundreds of them, across the country. Dr. Spanos was one of them. He was well respected. He practices medicine even now. He's Oxford trained. He has postgraduate training in the US, UK, and Singapore. And he talked about how to treat pain aggressively. And I'm sure he believed in what he said, although he did not do his research. Later on, he thought he had not done his research, but that was after all these revelations. When people got addicted, there's a solution. It's not addiction, it's pseudo-addiction. So they need more. So they got more. And the marketing strategy worked. The opioid sales skyrocketed across the country and under the radar. This was picked up by the chief pharmacist in the state of Washington. The state of Washington was responsible for the expenses of the patients treated for injuries. And she saw that the number of prescriptions of opiates was increasingly high for rather minor injuries. This couldn't happen. So she dug deeper into the database. They had a huge database. And she realized, prescriptions, hospital admissions, and now people are dying. Somebody comes with an ankle injury, and a year later the patient was dead. And she thought this could not happen. And that blew the bubble. And now everybody is talking about it. The lawmakers, the public, the physicians, and the vast majority of physicians were not part of this problem. And one of the investigations conducted by a federal office said, no company had ever used this kind of branded merchandise to market a so-called Schedule II drug, which is a drug which has high potential for abuse resulting in dependency. Well, in the US, you know what happens next. They got sued. And the company had to pay a lot. $600 million is a lot for the company to pay. I don't think any of the company executives went to jail. And $600 million is not a lot compared to the $15 billion the family is worth. The prescriptions came down, but not to the baseline. After more than 15 years of this problem started, the company decided not to market OxyContin to the doctors. So, coming back to our topic, where did it go wrong? Where was the practice of medicine not right? Is it a vocational part that didn't work? Is it a professional part? Is it a business part? Or is it a combination? Or is it something else? Let's look at some definitions. What's a vocation when it comes to medicine? Well, it started as a call by God in the 1600s in Europe. But in the modern, in this Stone Age, when it comes to medicine, it's a little bit of an overlap between what you love to do, what you're passionate about doing, and what the community needs. What's the need of the community? What's the community calling? And then are you trained well for that? And what you get paid for. It's a combination. And they talk about a sweet spot right in the middle, which probably do not exist for most of us. But so that's kind of a vague but a realistic definition of a profession. When it comes to the vocation, the profession, that's more clear. It's a paid occupation, needs formal qualification, usually involves prolonged training. It's not an 8-to-4 job in the US, but some people might carry a misconception that it's an 8-to-4 job. It's not an 8-to-4 job, even if it's a profession. What's a business? Any activity or enterprise entered into aimed at making a profit. What's a business when it comes to healthcare? In the United States, more than 75% of the hospitals are not for profit. What does that mean? That they cannot make a profit and benefit as an individual owner. There are no owners. These are entities, either religious organizations or entities which are not for profit. They do not pay federal taxes, they do not pay state taxes, they do not pay local taxes. So, for the most part, the US healthcare system is not for profit, although a lot of people believe otherwise. If you look at the healthcare spending in the US, it's twice as much as the mean healthcare spending in the OECD countries, what's showed in red there. If you look at what the federal government and the government entities spend, that amount alone is more than the mean for OECD countries. So you can realize that the healthcare expenditure in the United States is primarily by the federal government. The private insurance is big and huge, but it's not a critical component. So, let's get back to our original question. Where did it go wrong for Michael and the thousands of others who were in near identical situations, who could not make it, who could not realize their dreams of going to college, going to a job, having a family? Is it a vocational failure? Of course, yes. The doctors who prescribed them, some of them did not do a good job. There's a time there were doctors' clinics called pill mills, just producing patients were lining up to get prescriptions. And they were hiding behind the law. So it was an auto-vocational failure in most of them, or at least in some of them, but not all of them. Is it a professional failure? Of course, yes. Some of the doctors who practice, they prescribe the narcotics coming from just one letter to the editor from New England Journal of Medicine from years ago. No research, but they used it just to prescribe. So it was a professional field. What about the business side of it? When a physician operates a pill mill, that's a bad business model. But they did that, and a lot of them are in jail now. And the companies resorted to terrible business practices. It's terrible now, but they were under the radar. And some of the reps, an average rep in a good company might make about $20,000 in incentives. These guys made like $250,000 selling prescription heroin. So it's a combination of all the above to a degree which caused this epidemic. Let's change gear to New Zealand. This is Queenstown. They call it the adventure capital of the world. And if you go on a clear day, you'll see at least one skydiver. Just imagine what happens if you cut the cords of this parachute. The guy would come down and he would not make it. And that's what happened to one of the patients I cared for as a registrar. The patient came in with acute florid heart failure from mitral valve cord rupture. Mitral valve, as you may know, is a parachute valve, and when the cords rupture, that's not a very good situation. So the treatment is simple. It's surgery. It's emergency surgery. Survival is good, more than 95%. So I called my consultant, and he came in. Consultant was a great guy, a great teacher, very knowledgeable, and he had no private practice. But he decided to manage the patient medically, which he did, which we did, and the patient died, which was not expected, which was not unexpected. The reason he did that, he had two surgeons, one was on call, and the following day, both surgeons had full schedules. And some of those patients were subacute, and some of the patients were urgent, semi-urgent, and if he cancelled the list, if he did this particular patient, then he had to cancel at least a few patients. That may have made a different problem, a worse problem. So he made a conscious decision not to offer surgery at 2 a.m., which I agree with. So, what happened there? The vocational failure? I didn't think so. The consultant who made the decision, which I agreed with, I think he had to make a hard decision, and that's the reality of practicing medicine. You can't provide everything to everybody, and you have to draw a line somewhere. So the professional failure? No, the diagnosis was prompt, the management was great, not a lot you can do. So the business failure? Well, as I alluded to you in the US and also in New Zealand, it's not a true business, but there is a business model. That there's allocation of funds and you got to use it. You got to use it in the best way you can. The hospital decides to use it in the best way it could. And it had only 2 surgeons. It did not have the funds to get another 2 surgeons. So you could argue it was a business failure. Was it a combination? Probably not. Let's change gears to the hills of Sri Lanka, and that's overly common. I was the first medical officer there. I was keen to get started. I want to intubate patients, give cardioversions, all that fun stuff that you want to do after training. I wouldn't get any of that. The hospital would admit about 6 or 7, maybe 8 or 9 patients a month. The patients would bypass the hospital. They had no confidence or trust, and the practice was they would go to a larger hospital because they provided better care. Beautiful hospital, good staff, but not a lot to do. So this is what the hospital spent. I've adjusted to inflation. The hospital spent $3.5 million in today's terms a year on providing care for about 10 patients a month as inpatients and a few more in the outpatients. And if you break down, that's a breakdown. It's a busy slide, but it breaks it down to different expenses. I factored in the maintenance of the ambulance. The ambulance was used for private purposes. And the utilities like electricity and all that. And that has a cost, and somebody has to bear that. There's nothing called a free lunch anywhere. So what happened? Where did this go wrong? Vocational failure? There's no opportunity to practice anybody's vocation there. So professional failure, same thing. So the business failure, you could argue that it was not the best model. Again, we talk about the business side of healthcare. Even in the US, although people think it's a business, it's not a true business. It's charity by the government. So you could argue it was kind of a business failure. So what could you do? Close down the facility? You can't do that because it's not upgraded to the next level by the minister. So there's no way you could close it. Restructure makes sense. Reorganize. Across the group cuts, you could say there's no need for a doctor or an AMP, or no need for 3 nurses, make it 1. Or you could do strategic planning. This is what we would do in the States. You look at this patient, say, oh, you've seen 16 patients that month, and that's equivalent to 275,000 rupees worth of work, which should be paid by somebody, the insurance or the government, somebody will pay. That's how much you get. So you tell the staff and everybody who's involved with the hospital, we spent 4.5 million, and you guys did the work worth of 250,000, figure out a way of doing better. And that would be the start, and that would be the beginning of the strategic planning. And that's what we would do. Now, we can talk about all these issues about the vocation, the profession, the business side of it. But what are we trying to do? We're trying to provide good quality care. When it comes to a patient, as Dr. Herath was alluding to, they want the care they expect to be delivered. They don't necessarily care whether there's a vocational part or a business part. I'm sure they mind that, but not to the degree about the amount of the quality of care they get. So the overlapping point is that we got to provide safe, effective, patient-centered, timely, efficient, equitable. Number of definitions are there, but what we are trying to do and what the patient expects us to do is provide quality patient care. What is quality? This is interesting. This was coined by William Deming. He's probably the father of systems and processes. He was an engineer and a statistician. He was significantly responsible for the post-war recovery of Japan. Now he said good quality means predictable degree of uniformity. Predictable degree of uniformity. You know what to expect when you go for the same problem to 3 hospitals or the same hospital 3 times. Dependability. You can go at 1 o'clock and you get the same care you need. And the quality and standard suited to the customer. It's interesting that the quality in the industry, whether it's aviation industry or whether it's something else in the United States, is about 10 years ahead of the same parameters in healthcare. It's interesting that most of the quality measures that we initiate in the hospitals were initiated by industry about 10 years ago. So this is what Deming said 50 years ago. And that's what we are trying to implement now. So what Deming said that 85% of the failures or problems are because of failures in the processes and the systems. You go back and blame the doctor who prescribed the narcotics, which ended up with the death of that young boy. The doctor is in jail, but it did not fix the problem. It is a process failure and a system failure. Now, one of the solutions that he came up with for industry years ago, and we now adopt, is statistical process control and statistical quality control. And you might have heard about 6 Sigma, which means that you expect a certain amount of care or outcome, and you had 2 standard deviations above and below. If something goes out, then it must be a special cause variation. It must be a rogue doctor prescribing or something. So this was implemented in industry years ago, and now we are getting this into medicine, the practice of medicine. So, final verdict. Is it a vocation? Of course, it has to be a vocation. There's no way you could practice medicine without the vocational part. Is it a profession? Yes, you need training. And the doctor prescribes narcotics by just looking at a letter to the editor, which talks about just a specialized group of patients. That's not very professional. That's not good training. So they need more training. It's a business. It is a business too. So, since the opioid epidemic outbreak, has been significant changes. The professional part, the training, the guidelines have got stricter. The business side. So if a drug company comes and gives you a meal, it's reported. It's in public domain. So the industry's got much more organized and scrutinized now. The vocational part is a difficult part. The Institute of Medicine, which is a not-for-profit organization which looks at improving quality, would say you should have intrinsic motivation. And that's a difficult thing to measure. And that's where you go to the statistical process control and quality control. That's why you go back to the definition of quality. It's predictable, predictable degree of uniformity, the dependability, and the quality of standard the customer expects. So you make sure that you have your understanding, the guideline, the protocol, and you have a system to measure it. So, is it a vocation? The practice of medicine is a vocation? The answer is yes. Difficult to measure. Is it a profession? Of course it is. And it's easier to measure. Is it a business? It is a business, but not in the sense that we see McDonald's or any other similar business. And it's a different business, it's a different model. It's the business of healthcare, which is different. You saw the healthcare is funded primarily by the federal government in the United States. If you go further, in the United States is in trillions of dollars in debt. The debt is owned by the Chinese. So people could go further and say the healthcare is funded by the Chinese in the United States. And so it's a vocation, it's a profession, it's a business in a different sense. And it's also a process. It has to be linked to a process. And none of these things can support without the structure of the system. Without a system in place, none of these pillars would function. So it is a process where all these things come together. I have an update. Last week, the family-owned company announced that now they have an antidote for the opioid. I don't know what they're going to call it. Maybe OxyContin mild, but that's been approved, so it's funny. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Rivera.